The European arms industry is forecasting that it has no ability to produce new weapons for Ukraine. Just how is Europe, with a 3-year head start, unable to ramp up any kind of domestic military production? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about this, plus more importantly, what it means for the Ukrainians. Let's get into it. Okay. So this is one of those stories that kind of bums me out, right? So the headline sounds really good. EU to produce 2 million artillery shells in 2025, according to the new defense commissioner. But the problem is that's exactly how many shells the Europeans produced for the Ukrainians this year in 2024. Right. In fact, there were lots of concerns, he said, about whether Europe has sufficient production capacity to boost military support for Ukraine. The defense minister said that only about 1 in 5 EU-supplied weapons are produced within the bloc. Everything else is purchased from external sources, meaning that should the Europeans have to actually defend themselves, they would have basically no capacity to do so. Right. Now, they said, of course, that increasing arms production depends on European governments actually, ordering more arms production. And without long-term contracts with defense manufacturers, Europe is unlikely to ramp up weapons and ammunition production in Ukraine in the coming years, right? He says that EU budget funds cannot be used to buy weapons for Ukraine. Numerous restrictions. This is, I think, the key takeaway here on investing in defense industries outside the EU. But funds from the European Peace Facility or frozen Russian assets can be utilized for arms procurement. And so what it seems like Europe has done to itself is by introducing a massive regulatory burden. You know that if you want to sell, if you want to sell kebabs in Europe, it is a nightmarishly long permitting process. So much so that a lot of European economic activity is underground. But imagine if you wanted to manufacture artillery shells in the EU. It would be an insanely expensive process. Now, before I break down exactly what this means in the larger economic context and for Ukraine, I wanted to mention that you should consider purchasing a little Christmas present for our friends in Ukraine. You guys know that I was in Ukraine last month. We're dropping some of the interviews here in the next coming weeks, but those units that helped me out, helped keep me safe at the front, we are raising funds for them. And it's a cold, tough winter. They're going to need all the help they can get. So folks, including the 25th Brigade, the Liut Brigade, the Rubiza Brigade, those guys are looking for drones, jammers, thermals, night vision devices, all the things they need to make this a bad winter for the Russians. So if you want to help out, of course, as always, guys, more or less, every dollar helps these guys, but if you donate $200, basically every $200 you donate, that's about the cost of an FPV drone. So every time you raise a drone for these guys, they will hook you up with patches. And again, I think that's pretty cool. The idea that you go out there, you handle some of the most important logistics for these units, and they recognize your efforts. And that's pretty huge. But what I also want to point out, one of the things I learned at the front lines is that the units don't get, these are not supplementary allocations. The Central Command provides minimal gear to these units. They depend on fundraising. It's not like, if we buy them an extra Mavic. No, this is the Mavic that they're going to fly. So you can be confident when you make these donations that it's going to go directly into these units' hands. And these guys, again, are working so hard, really making life hard for the Russian military. So the link is in the description, as always. You can also check out strikegum.com if you want to pick up some gum going into the new year. We've got some Christmas sales going on. Okay, so here's what I want to point out. European economy has some larger problems with it, right? And you can see this. Let's look at the 10-year GDP growth chart. And I want to point out that basically you have these 2 COVID years where the European economy absolutely got crushed and has not really recovered. These are individual quarters. You can see that other than some growth in 2017, the European economy has been unbelievably slow growing. And in the last several years, you can see that basically since about 2022, the European economy has essentially grown at a rate of 0. And so the reason you can also see in 2019, it's not uncommon for European economy to experience no growth at all. And this is like pretty astoundingly low. Let's contrast this, by the way, with the US of A. Let's see if we can find our GDP growth rate here over 10 years. Yeah, so contrast this with the US economy, right? You can see that it's rare that it has being under 2% growth is pretty unusual. And you can see what happened, right? There was the COVID collapse of a huge portion of the U.S. economy collapsing, but then it roared back, right? The EU economy lost about 10%, regained about 10%. The American economy coming back by 35%, and then having stellar growth since then. And you can see that, again, the American economy, it's rare to see a 2% growth quarter. The Europeans barely breaking even. So what this means is that there is no capacity there's a lot of things that this means, but what this says is that something is stopping the European, because Europe has a large economy about the size of the United States, and it has a population about the size of the United States that's comparably educated. So why then do Europeans are they not able to grow their economy in the same way? In fact, even the Russian economy is growing way more briskly than Europe. And this is sort of a huge problem. And the fact that the Europeans are unable to even spend money to purchase things from their own countries is pretty insane, right? Because literally the European economy is ready to spend tax money, but it can't spend it in its own country, right? To say, oh, we need to buy artillery shells. Why don't we buy from France, from Germany, from the Czech Republic? The answer is, it seems like these are just regulated out of existence. And this is a huge liability for the Europeans for a variety of reasons. First, Europe is personally at risk because if let's say Russia defeats Ukraine and Russia goes, well, listen, the Europeans, we've proven that Russia has mobilized its defense industry, it's revamped its economy, it's cut through regulations in order to produce weapons and munitions at scale. Europe is unable to do so. And so Russia likely says, well, we are not going to worry about European aggression because it doesn't have the capacity to physically resist us, right? And that is a massive problem, right? You know, if they can beat the large Ukrainian military supplied by the EU and NATO partners, then they certainly are going to feel empowered to beat the much more anemic, small European militaries. The second problem is that for Europe, it creates a liability because much of in the event of a real war, this Ukraine war is a real war. In the event of a war with an EU member country, right? Those external suppliers could be cut off, right? Imagine a scenario where the US president says, hey, I'm mad at Europe for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to allow them to purchase US weapons as part of their defensive effort in this war. Well, they would look around and they would say, man, we are now in grave danger. There's also a geopolitical risk of physically getting weapons to Europe, right? What if there were a situation in which Europe is in a war, but ports are sanctioned, or their adversaries sink commercial vessels with drones or missiles, and they're physically unable to get even basic weapon systems, basic ammunition to their continent, right? And of course, this is also dangerous for Ukraine because it is a signal to Russia that Europe is physically unable to do more, right? And remember, this is after a 3-year lead time, right? And every European leader seems able to say the correct thing, which is we need to be better prepared for conflict. Russia is clearly not interested in integrating into the EU. They explicitly view themselves as a separate Eurasian security. Putin's term is a member of the Eurasian security architecture, which juxtaposes itself to the EU. So every European leader can say these things, but no European leader is able to actually produce more weapons at scale in a way that could resist Russian aggression. And this is a huge, should be for most countries, a huge red alert. Again, it's already should be considered a red alert for the United States, the changing nature of war, our inability to produce an adequate number of shells to fight, again, Russia, a smaller, more economically impoverished country. That should trouble us, because if the United States were to have to, for example, contest Taiwan against China, China is an order of magnitude more capable of manufacturing in-house than the United States. And so the fact that we have one or two artillery plants is troubling, but the fact that the Europeans appear to have basically none is even more frightening. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Hit that subscribe button. That makes a difference for me. And I hope you're having a good Christmas holiday with your family. Thanks to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our lieutenant tier members. I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.